Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Since you last testified before the committee, Congress did pass the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, and although many members on my side of the aisle voted against it, mostly because there was no Republican input and then ultimately no House input in the bill. Having said that, I do recognize it is now the law of the land, and I respect that fact. My focus now is going to be on oversight of the law and ensuring that it's implemented efficiently, effectively, and adheres to the letter of the law. And why is this important? Because our nation is dealing with crisis after crisis, from a spending crisis to an energy crisis. We have a supply chain crisis, a workforce shortage crisis, and all of these problems are feeding into an historic inflation crisis. And it's astounding that inflation has increased 550%. Americans know that they can no longer buy the same amount of food or gasoline or other necessities with their hard-earned dollars as they could just a year and a half ago. Obviously not by a long shot. And the same holds true for our infrastructure dollars. Committee Republicans heard some pretty grim warnings last week during our roundtable on inflation. Companies working in the transportation space are struggling with the exploding costs across the board. And some of these companies can't shoulder the risk of inflation, which means some of the businesses, especially smaller ones, are unable to even bid on some of the jobs. At the same time, states are running over their transportation budgets as they have the impossible task of estimating project costs, which are going to continue to increase exponentially. In my home state of Missouri, they're estimating that they're going to go $140 million over budget in their current year's transportation plan. States are also receiving fewer and fewer bids on their projects. With all the regulatory red tape, they aren't able to get through the process in time for a company's proposal to stay true to their original estimated costs. And that's why it's incumbent upon the department and Congress to make sure that every single dollar from the law counts and is directed towards projects safely and efficiently to move people, to move goods, and clear the bottlenecks that are adding to the supply chain crisis. However, many stakeholders have already expressed concerns about the administration's implementation of the infrastructure law, and I share some of those concerns. Just to highlight a few, one of the concerns to me and many others is the December 16th of last year, the Federal Highway Administration guidance memo. Mr. Secretary, I know that you've spoken about some of the concerns raised since this guidance was issued, but I hope you recognize the fact that it remains a serious source of concern and confusion because it pushes the administration's own priorities, including a bias towards adding new highway capacity over what's written in the law itself. Another related concern I have is the number of the department's competitive grant notices that also include language doubling down on the federal highway guidance. The notices for grant programs like the Infra Grant, RAISE, the Mega Grants Rural, and the Reconnecting Communities, they all clearly show that the administration isn't as laser focused as it needs to be on fundamental transportation policy and projects that actually improve mobility. One additional concern I want to highlight is in regard to the one federal decision provisions which were included in the law and are critical to cutting the red tape for so many of the projects. Instead of simply implementing the OFD provisions, the administration released its action plan on project permitting on May 11th, and it doesn't seem to mention OFD. So again, here's another example of the law laying out an explicit policy which the administration appears to be ignoring in favor of accelerating projects that fit its own agenda. The result of the administration putting its agenda ahead of the law of the land, and even acting in contradiction to the law in some cases, is the infrastructure funding. Already, it's dramatically devalued by this crippling inflation, as has been pointed out, and is being diluted even further. This is not shaping up to be the infrastructure bill that Americans were promised. And now more than ever, this administration needs to focus on real infrastructure and on policies that can get us out of so many of these crises. So with that, I do want to thank the chairman again for holding this hearing, and Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I know you are busy, but coming before Congress, it does mean a lot to a lot of members.